climate warming, but they're not all doing poorly the same way. Spruce wasn't negatively impacted, but fir was. Birch wasn't negatively impacted, but aspen was. Whether this is generally predictive, way too soon to tell. I think we need to do this experiment for multiple years and multiple sites to really know that. But it does suggest that our general notions of what's going to happen might be true, but that there's going to be some wild cards because all these species aren't created equal. So, which future will we have? I still don't know. Our experiment's not going to fully give us this answer. It and many of the other kinds of studies, observational studies, modeling studies, gradient studies and the like, will help us have a better idea of it, but we still really won't know. So given that we do know, though, that fire, wind, and climate change and other things will have major impacts on our forests, what should our goals be for the future forests? Should we preserve or restore the past, try to hold on to our spruce, fir, and pine forests, even if appropriate habitat and climate no longer exists 50 years from now? Should we let nature decide and just say, well, nature included human-induced climate change, nature will take care of itself, something will take over? Or should we actively aim for new forests to best match the new climate and say, hey, if we don't do something, we're going to lose our current forest, we're not going to get a new forest, maybe we should plant oaks and hickories and maples that we think will do best. Which do you all think we should do? You know, we don't have to do anything, but we do need to decide whether we're going to do anything or not. And our agencies are always very busy thinking about this, the Forest Service, private companies, counties, state.
Doctor, can you even attempt to do the first one? Preserve and restore?
That's a good question. Some people think we can do some of it.
How would you do any of it?
Well, you can do it in some sense by trying to find, within, let's say, the boundary waters, the places that are coldest and most mesic, and that are most likely habitat where things like spruce fir will hang on, and work to try to manage things like wildfire in a way that would enhance that. So you're not trying to maintain it exactly like it was in the past, but you could try to manage so that you maintain this for longer than it would otherwise be. I'm not saying I agree or disagree, but that's one thought. And some people think that we should spend a lot of time and effort doing this. Actually, none of these are very popular with almost anyone, which is interesting. Which suggests maybe what we really need to do is stop climate change because we don't like any of our choices here. And that's one thing we can try to do.
I know that a rise in temperature is critical to the life cycle of amphibians. Mm-hmm. What about insects that are dangerous to some of these trees? Like we were infested with something that affected our balsams.
Well, in general, as I pointed out earlier, the general notion of the entomologist is that many insects and diseases are very temperature sensitive, especially insects can have more generations each year, and therefore their population can grow almost exponentially more with warming than it would without warming, and that creates these large potential for very large insect outbreaks that can have very negative consequences. And so some people think that things such as changes in drought and changes in insects will far outweigh any of the direct effects of the warming. So this is a big issue. But we don't, that's a hypothesis that insects will be really, really bad. We don't know that for a fact.
And is there an increase or decrease in the effect on the boreal forest from water contamination, groundwater contamination?
Well, luckily in most of the areas where there's widespread boreal forest, there's not a lot of water contamination yet. Now if you're alluding to things such as mining,
yes,
certainly places where there's mining, that's a completely different issue, but it's a big issue. Water contamination could potentially have an impact, more likely to have an impact in the water, in the lakes and streams and rivers and wetlands than in the upland forests. But that's one of these big decisions we have to make as a society as well. What do we do with our landscape in the next 20, 40, 60 years? Not only how do we manage the forest, but how do we manage and think about things such as other economic development, which actually gets to going back to this Boreal Resilience project we have, where we're trying to actually partner with policymakers, agencies, public citizens, industry groups, environmental groups, to think about things such as, well, what's going to be the best mix of environmental and economic goals in the future? Maybe we decide that if you do the analysis that stopping timber harvesting and stopping second home development, but but allowing mining is the best thing for the environment and the economy, then how do we do that? I'm not saying it would be. It might be that we should have no mining, that the best thing is to only have second home development and become purely a tourist mecca. But those are questions. We don't actually have the information to fully answer them yet. It requires a lot of hard sleuthing to figure out what will be the best mix. And then we also have to throw in our social and cultural values. People who value the notion that we're producing, harvesting trees and logging and producing timber is important. That's a valid social more. Someone else might value not having that landscape. But we exist as a population of people, and if we're going to do anything coherent and clever, we have to work together. Because otherwise what happens is the Forest Service, Jim Saunders can tell you this, anything the Forest Service does, they get sued by both the environmental groups and industry groups. And all three groups then spend enormous amounts of money and time fighting rather than actually working together to make solutions. Now you could argue that each group has good reasons for doing what it does, but I would argue that it's actually not a very smart way collectively to go ahead as a society in moving forward. And that our little project is intended to try to at least begin or enhance dialogue among all the disparate groups to think about, given that change is inevitable, in some ways I view this is an opportunity to get out of our past mindsets and get out of our box about thinking that the other side is wrong, and start to think, well, how do we actually manage our economy and our societies so that in the future we have an environment that's as good as it can be. And I put good in quotes because good is someone who likes to hunt for grouse might think the environment needs to be different than someone who values old growth pine. But how collectively we can enhance and maintain environmental quality and economic vitality in the region. And that's no mean feat, because this is an area that's had economic struggles for
regular temperature?
yeah, the way we're doing this, and I'll explain this in the field, is we're not just turning the lamps on. We have very high-tech control, so we're maintaining and we don't do this in the winter, but from early April till November, constant difference. So if it's 45 degrees in the morning, it's 47 in the morning, and then as it goes up, it just tracks that difference. It's not perfect, but it works pretty well. Other questions?
Did you, or how did you keep deer out?
Yes.
And
Big fence.
Okay, big fences. And did you have plots where you let deer in?
No, that would have been perfect, because this experiment is narrow, and it doesn't look at interactions of indirect factors such as deer and fire and the like,
Okay.
and which would be great to do, but it's basically just looking at the direct effects. And so
And then, did you have any, you planted all these things. Did you do any native plots with just what's
well, actually,
now?
we planted into the intact understory. So it's planted into a matrix, so to speak, of big leaf aster and raspberry and
So
other
your
shrubs.
plots are not all planted, or?
No,
Okay.
and so they are relatively intact, except that we planted into them. And if you'll see, the native vegetation is doing very well. And so that's one of the big questions is, in the real warming world, plants don't just compete with themselves, they compete with other trees, but they also compete with all the herbs and shrubs. So we're looking at that, because if the shrubs are stimulated by warming, they could suppress the trees, even if a tree growing by itself in a pot might do well with warming. So that's part of the complications we're trying to look at.
How much did you warm the soil? And
Same
what-
amount, 1.8 degree and 3.6 degrees.
And what made you decide to warm it that much? Just
Well, basically, when we look at the predictions, this part of the world, well, globally, we expect it to get between 2 and 6 degrees Celsius warmer by the end of the century. Predictions here should get, well, you saw as much as 8 or 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, which is about 6 degrees Celsius. We wanted to do something that was nearer term. So, what's it going to be like in 20 or 30 or 40 years, or maybe 60 or 70 years? But it was somewhat an arbitrary decision.
And you don't think that warming the atmosphere above with the lights and stuff would have accomplished warming the soil the same amount or not?
No, it wouldn't. We've done some testing, and this, because the vegetation absorbs so that the radiation doesn't get down to the soil. Like in a desert or a really open grassland, lamps can warm the soil somewhat, but we had to do both.
Okay, Peter, thank you very much.